Good News Productions International presents the medical aspects of the crucifixion with Dr. Jameso Fuzel.
Several years ago, as a medical man, I began to wonder exactly why it was that Christ died from a medical standpoint. And I know that we are told repeatedly that he died on the cross, but from a medical standpoint, actually what did cause his immediate death? I need to mention some individuals who have written on the subject. Most of the information that I'm going to be given will be taken from research into Roman history, various books, and to a large extent to an article by a Dr. E. Truman Davis, who appeared in who wrote an article which appeared in the Arizona Medical Association magazine in the 1960s, entitled The Crucifixion. I have been concerned because of several things. Number one, I do not believe that Christ was a meek, mild, anemic individual, and I cannot picture him that way. And yet that's the type of pictures that we often see portraying what Christ must have looked like at the time he was on earth. As you know, the area around Jerusalem is very, very much like a desert area, very similar to my own home area of Phoenix, Arizona. And we know that Christ walked from one place to another. He was not an individual who was able to go by car. He had to walk the dusty byways, and as such, he had to be a much stronger individual than normally portrayed. In fact, I have always thought that most of the portrayals of him make him look as if he is either anemic or in the very last stages of tuberculosis, and I do not believe that Christ was that way. And so I began to study a bit about what actually happened when a person was crucified and when they were scourged from the standpoint of Roman history. And so I want to share with you some of those impressions and some of the medical reasons that we can project as a possible cause of Christ's death on the cross. Now, we know that Wednesday was a very quiet day in Jerusalem. We know that Christ and his apostles were at the house of Mary, where they partook of what we would normally call the Last Supper. And then following that time, Christ, with at least three of the disciples, Peter, James, and John, crossed the Kidron Creek on his way to the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, I would have to mention the condition probably of Kidron Creek when he crossed it, because this would have a great effect emotionally on almost any individual, particularly if he knew that he was going to have to go to the cross himself as a sacrifice for us. Usually at the time of the Passover, just before the Passover, there were thousands of animals that were slaughtered. And as they were slaughtered on the altar, there was a groove in that altar and a trough that left a Kidron Creek, so that creek probably was running red with blood. It would not have been unusual. It was that way quite often when Christ crossed that creek. And then when he came to probably what was the temple area, the temple would have been covered with vines, the walls, and you probably remember then that great sermon that he gave, I am the vine and you are the branches. He went from there then to Gethsemane, and we're told that he went up the mountain of Gethsemane to pray 3 different times. He asked the 3 apostles to wait and pray with him while he was on the mountain, as each time, as you know, they were asleep when he came down to talk to them. But one time when he was on the mountain praying, we are told in the scriptures that the sweat poured from him and as blood. Actually, I suppose in the vernacular we would have to say that he sweated blood during that particular time. Theologians for years have tried to explain that away. There's no need to. There is a medical condition called hematidrosis, Hematidrosis. It's a recognized condition. It is a condition whereby a person under a great deal of stress will have the little capillaries at the base of each of the sweat glands rupture. so that as the sweat pours forth under great emotion, blood is lost in rather copious amounts. Now, as I said, that's a recognized medical condition. We do not have to explain it away. Certainly it would give us an idea about the emotional aspect of the prayers of Christ on the Mount before he returned to the Garden of Gethsemane. Usually, in a medical sense, a person with this condition of hematidrosis would go into shock because of blood loss, and very often they die. But it's enough to be said that since our body is covered with thousands and thousands, in fact millions of sweat glands, if the little capillaries at the base of each sweat gland were to rupture, then a person would lose a tremendous amount of blood. After his prayers on the garden at Gethsemane, he went down and with his disciples, and about midnight, we're told that a large company of Roman soldiers, the word that's used would normally mean a group of about 600 men, came to arrest him. Now, I have wondered, well, why did they send 600 men to arrest one man? Well, in fact, if we had a great leader these days whom just a few days before had been followed into town and hailed as a king with crowds of people praising him and shouting Hosanna and spreading palm leaves in his path, we would probably expect that if we were going to arrest such a leader, that we must absolutely carry enough men to take care of the mobs. Now, the mobs were not there, as we know. I think this is rather interesting, though, that those 600 men, according to one place in the Scripture, were caused to fall backward to the ground by a simple 3 words of Christ. Those 3 words were, "I am He." Someone said, "Where is this Christ that we're looking for?" And Christ said, "I am He." And one of the Scriptures says that when he said that, all of the Roman soldiers fell backward to the ground. Now, we know, I think that's important for us to realize. It makes us realize exactly what the sacrifice of Christ was on that cross, because he could have stopped the whole procedure at any time. He didn't. He knew what he was going to have to go through. He knew the suffering and the agony, and yet by 3 simple words, he could cause a whole group of Roman soldiers to fall to the ground. We know another way that Christ could have stopped at any time he wanted from his own words. Because in that garden, if you remember, Peter was told not to resist at all, and yet Peter, being who he was and with his impetuous nature, pulled his sword and cut off the ear of Marcus, one of the men who came. Christ replace that ear, showing some of his mercy, some of his love for mankind, even the adversary. And he informed Peter that if I had wanted legions of angels, I could have had legions of angels to resist this arrest. So you see, he could have called on legions of angels to stop it, or he could, by his own words, have stopped the whole procedure. He chose not to do so. And he chose not to do so because he knew that which he must do. I say that particularly to prevent some people from having the idea that Christ wished to not have to go through the crucifixion enough that on the Mount in his prayers he asked his Father, if this cup, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. That was not what he meant. He was not trying to prevent what he knew that he must do. He was willing to sacrifice his life and go through agony for us, and I think we should keep that in mind all the time that we're discussing the crucifixion. Now, after he was arrested, which was somewhere around midnight, he was taken to the house of Annas. Annas was not really the chief priest, but this was not a legal trial at any time because it occurred at night, and that was against Jewish law. But actually he was taken to the house of Annas because Annas was a father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the chief priest at that particular time, and I guess Annas was the power behind the throne. And there he was questioned over and over. We know that at that time Christ received the first physical blows because we're told that he was mocked, that he was spat upon, that actually he was struck by at least one soldier because he refused to answer a question. So he underwent a great deal of abuse. Remember now also that he has walked a considerable distance after having been at the Last Supper, and had lost a great deal of blood with the sweating of blood on the as he was praying. So a normal man would have been in a weakened condition. A normal man would probably have not been able to go through the trial that he went through during that night. We know that he was taken back and forth from Annas to Caiaphas during the night. The Jews did not attempt to take him to Pilate that night because, of course, that would have been against their Jewish law. But they did keep him from having any rest whatsoever. He was unable to sleep. So he has gone through also a sleepless night. We are told that during none of this time was he given anything to either eat or drink. And this becomes important later on when we talk about the actual cause of death of Christ. Now, eventually he was taken to Pilate. And when he was taken to Pilate, you know the story, and I won't go into all the questions and all of the minute details, except that it seems that Pilate felt that he did not want any part of this execution, and he sent Christ to Herod. Herod then, of course, also did not want any part of it and sent him back to Pilate. Pilate was forced to do something. We are told simply that after a period of time, Pilate decided, made the statement, I find nothing wrong in this man, but the crowd still called for his crucifixion. Then we're told that Pilate caused Christ to be scourged. Now, this was an unusual situation. Before a crucifixion, scourging was usually not necessary. In fact, scourging itself was very often a very punishment which led to death. Now, let's examine a little bit the Roman custom of scourging. In the first place, they used something similar to this implement that I have here. It's called a flagellum in the Roman history books. And it usually had, as I have shown here, a very short handle. It had from 3 to 9 large, heavy leather straps. Each one of those leather straps, about an inch from the end, had a lead ball, or in some cases, a dumbbell-shaped piece of lead, about an inch from the end of each strap. And then again, about a foot from the end of each strap, there was a second lead ball. If you have read anything about the Shroud of Turin, and if you happen to believe in that, the indication there was that the flagellum that was used had 3 straps instead of the multiple ones that I have shown here, and the lead was supposedly dumbbell-shaped, if you're to believe that story of the Shroud of Turin. But what happened actually then in Roman history when a person was scourged? Well, in the first place, the individual to be scourged was stripped of all of his clothes, and then he was tied, his hands were tied together, and they were then suspended from the ceiling by a rope around their hands so that they could barely be on their tiptoes. Now, there was a reason for this. A person that was pulled up in that way could not move either forward or backward to resist the full force of the blows. So Christ was suspended in this way, with his hands above his head, and then the Roman soldier who did the actual scourging would stand back with the flagellum in hand and then strike the person to be scourged repeatedly with all of his strength with this particular type of implement. It might be interesting to note that the Jewish law required that anyone who was to be scourged was not to be struck more than 40 times. So someone has said that Christ was not struck more actually than 39, because the Jews were very, very careful. If the law said not more than 40, they decided that they would be extra careful, and they usually used 39 lashes. But we have to remember that this was not the case insofar as Jesus was concerned, necessarily, because he was not flogged by the Jews. He was flogged by the Roman soldiers. Now, what happens in a scourging? Well, as the person is struck first on their back and the legs with this particular strap, these little lead balls, anywhere that they might strike, would cause a rupture of the blood vessels just underneath the skin, so that little blebs would form on the skin, and those blebs would be full of blood. Simple explanation is a blood blister. We've all had those when we've pinched a finger or something of that sort. And then as they continued to strike the individual with this, those little blebs would be ruptured. And as the blebs were ruptured, then bleeding would start. Now, the capillaries immediately under the surface of the skin, and the dermis part, we would call it, those blood vessels are very small. They're capillary. So the bleeding at first would not be heavy. But as they continued to strike with this flagellum, it would begin to tear through the upper layers of the skin and dig into what we call the epidermis, or the portion of skin, the subcutaneous tissue below the skin itself. And that contained much larger blood vessels. And then when those began to be torn, the bleeding would become rather copious. They would continue to strike the individual, and as they continued to do this, the skin would eventually be torn into shreds, and these balls, these lead balls, would begin to bite not only into the subcutaneous tissue, but into the muscle itself. Perhaps it's enough to say that in Roman history, a person who was scourged in that manner, usually at the end of the scourging, the skin of the back would actually hang in shreds, and even the muscles themselves would be torn, and bleeding would be extremely heavy because the blood vessels in the muscles themselves are quite large, so that the bleeding would be copious. Now, you remember that Christ has lost blood on the Mount. He has had no sleep. He's not had anything either to eat or drink during this period of time. And now he has lost a great deal of blood and undergone a great deal of torment, suffering by the simple scourging. Now, the Bible only says, very simply, that Christ was scourged. And then it tells us that after he was scourged, the next thing that happened was that they placed a purple robe upon his back and put the crown of thorns on his head. Now, the crown of thorns is something that we have in Arizona as a plant. It is made up of very sharp thorns of about this length, and actually the plant itself has a sap. And even as these little thorns are broken, this sap would seep into a wound, and it's a poisonous sap in the green type of the plant, and that in itself could be a danger. Now, we were told after he was after the purple robe was put on his shoulders, the crown of thorn was put on his head, and then he was struck repeatedly by the soldiers on his head, so that these thorns would be driven into the skull, actually, into the skin to the skull. And if you've ever cut your head at any time, you know that the scalp is generously furnished with blood vessels, so that anytime you injure it, the bleeding is profuse. So again, we have a cause for bleeding. And then we're told that after the crown of thorns and after he was put into the purple robe, that he was still struck several times, that he was mocked and spit upon, and then he was pushed out on the balcony, and the people were told, "Behold your king." Then we're simply told that he was taken back into the area, and that the purple robe was taken from his shoulders. Now, I don't know about you, but I imagine most of us have had the occasion, at least as children, when we were roller skating or riding bicycles, that we've had occasion to fall and what we would say in the vernacular, skin a knee. I suppose in the medical I should say we produce an abrasion on a knee. Now, once that happened when I was a child, I did not dread the scrape itself as much as I dreaded the treatment, because as soon as I got home, my mother would always wash that, which hurt in itself, but then she'd put on a nice clean bandage. Now, this was the days before talfa, the non-stick dressings, if you remember. And so that nice, clean dressing would be put on and taped in place. Then I had another dread. I dreaded the time that had to come off, because if you've ever had that sort of thing happen, you know that that dressing, the cloth, will stick to the wound. Actually, what happens is the blood goes into the fibers of the cloth, and when that happens, then clotting occurs, that when it's removed, it removes all of that surface, and the bleeding and the pain would be all over again to be suffered. Now, we're simply told that Christ had the robe removed when he went back into the area, but think what must have happened to that back that had been so torn by the scourging. As they removed the robe from him, the blood had saturated and clotted, then it would start the bleeding all over again, and it would be just as bad and perhaps even worse than it was in the first place. But we're only told that they removed the robe. And then Christ was required to walk to the Golgotha, where he was to be crucified. This is about 650 yards, and it would naturally be uphill. As Christ made that walk up the hill, we're told that he carried the cross. And now I think it's time that we discussed a little bit about the cross and the type of cross that was used for crucifixion. The idea of crucifixion probably came from Persia originally, and it came by way of Alexander the Great. It was introduced throughout that part of the world at that time, and the Romans probably picked up the idea through it having been carried to that area by Alexander the Great. The Romans had a way of perfecting anything of that sort, particularly in punishment, and so they probably had altered the original type of crucifixion somewhat from the way it was practiced in Persia. Now, crucifixion, actually there was two kinds of cross that were used. There was a cross that was shaped somewhat like this, that was set in place, and then the individual was lifted up and nailed or tied to that cross at the time of crucifixion. This was not the type of cross that was normally used by the Romans. Instead, they used a cross that was shaped more like this. And for obvious reasons, it was called the Ta cross. You see, the T. Ta, of course, meaning the letter T. Now, someone will say, yes, but why is it then that the cross is always pictured in this configuration? Well, if you'll think a bit, you'll remember that as the cross was in place, then we're told that there was the titulus, or a sign was put on top, which stated King of the Jews in 3 languages. Now, if I put such a sign there, you can conjecturally imagine that this would again look more like the type of cross that's normally pictured that Christ was carrying. However, we can be fairly sure, not only because of the fact that the Romans used the Ta cross rather than the other type more, there's another reason that we can be relatively sure that Christ was crucified on the type of cross like this. And that is that with the wood that was available in the area at that time, this cross arm, or the platibulum as they would call it, would weigh about at least 100 pounds with almost any of the woods that would have been used. Now, if you will think then that since Christ was raised above the crowd so that they could see his suffering, and so that the Romans and the Jews could make sure that the crowd were looking up to see him, then this portion was probably quite tall. There's another reason we know it was tall, and that was because of the fact that, if you remember in the account of the crucifixion, that one of the soldiers offered a sponge mixed with sour wine and gall up to Christ on the cross, and it said that the words mean that they probably put that on a lance so that they could reach up to where he was. So we know he was quite high. In that case, this portion, or the stapes as they call it, had to be quite large. And it usually was set in place at the point that the individual who was to be crucified, in that place that he was to be crucified. So this was set in the ground and remained in that part. The part that the individual was usually required to carry was this part, or the platybulum. Now, normally they would tie this to the individual's back as they marched up to the place of crucifixion, in this case, Golgotha. Imagine, if you can, again, this is rough-hewn. It was not a nice, plain, smooth piece of lumber, but it was rough-hewn with an axe. And because of that, it would be a very rough thing. Now, imagine again, if you will, having this tied to your back, when the back is so torn and the muscles even exposed and all of the nerves exposed, and as you're walking up, trudging up that hill, just imagine what would happen every time that 100-pound weight of wood would shift and move with every step you took. So it's no wonder that about halfway up the area to Golgotha that we're told that Christ fell, and then he was assisted to carry the cross the rest of the way. Now remember this, Christ has not had sleep, he's had nothing to eat or drink, he has lost blood on many occasions, the last of which was the very fact that this heavy wooden beam on his back would have torn open the blood vessels and caused rather copious bleeding at that time. So it is important for us to realize that Christ was not a meek, mild individual. He must have been a very strong individual, and even with help from his Father in heaven. He must have been extremely strong to be able to go as far as he did before he was unable to go further from a physical standpoint. Now, once the individual then arrives at the place of execution or crucifixion, then certain other things happen. Number one, this portion, the patibulum, is thrown down upon the ground. And then the person to be crucified is thrown backwards also on the ground, and the hands were placed on each side, one on each side of the cross itself, or the patibulum, the cross arm of the cross. And then the person is nailed, the hands were nailed to the cross. Again, I have seen pictures showing Christ being with the hands tied to the cross. I don't know why they would do that, except I'll explain a little bit later. If they do not want an individual to die rapidly with crucifixion, then they very often did tie the hands to the cross. And I've also seen platforms placed on the cross so that people could rest their feet. Again, they allowed that only if they wanted the individual on the cross to live for a longer period of time. But if they wanted him to die very soon, they did not use the platform. They nailed both the feet and the hands. Not too many years ago, with some excavations in Jerusalem, with the building of new buildings, in fact, it was near one of the great gates of Jerusalem, original gates, with some digging or excavation, they brought up some metatarsal bones, actually the metatarsal bones of an individual, and it showed that those bones were still held together by a nail, somewhat like this. So we do know that that's a kind of a proof that this was a type of execution or crucifixion that was carried on at the time, because it roughly dated with the time of Christ, supposedly, on analysis. Now, the nails that were used, again, were not normal nails. They were not just simple round nails. They were roughly forged. They were usually square. They usually were about 7 inches long and somewhat roughened from being forged in the normal method. Now, again, we are told, or we are shown in a lot of cases, that the nail was driven through the palm of the hand in this manner for the person to be suspended on the cross. Well, this has actually been tried by various ones with dead bodies to see what would happen if you tried to suspend somebody from nails driven through the palms. Invariably, when this was attempted, the nail would tear through and it would be impossible to suspend the individual on the cross. So the usual place the Romans put the nails was in this part of the I suppose you'd say, wrist. And it's possible, if you feel in this area, you can feel an indentation here, and that's the area exactly that the nail was usually placed. And in experiments, it's shown that that will hold a great deal of weight if it's placed there. Now, that's important again. It's important for the fact that in this area, there are large nerves, the radial nerve, the ulnar nerve. If the nail is placed through this portion of the wrist, by the way, and probably the reason they say the palm is because even today medically, and back then also, when they talked about the palm, they included this portion of the hand, or when they talked about the hand, they include this portion of the wrist. So we could today say through the hand and still mean this area. But when this nail is driven through this area, it comes very close to the large nerves. I suppose to help you to understand what kind of pain that would involve, I would have to remind those of you who have ever been to a dentist and had a tooth filled, and then you went home after having had that tooth filled with silver, and perhaps you were eating with a knife, hopefully not a knife, with a fork, and you touched that filling. It's almost like an electric shock. There's an intense pain, and that's because of an electrical charge that's caused by the presence of the two metals together. Well, that's the sort of pain you could expect if this nail had been driven very close to those large nerves. Now, the individual was thrown backwards, as I say, with their arms not outstretched like this, but bent, just about like this. They were thrown backwards, and then the hands were nailed to this portion of the cross, the patibulum or cross arm, and then the individual with the patibulum was raised up and then set on top of the stapes, which was already in the ground at the time. Now, at that time then, they probably would have placed the title or titulus on top of that, and then they would nail the feet to the stapes of the cross. Again, when they nailed those feet together, they did not nail them just in a simple way, but there was a very formal way in which they did this. Usually the left foot was always placed over the right foot, such as this, and then the nail was nailed through the tarsal, or the bones of the feet, so that then as the individual was suspended, he was not suspended like this and straight up, but with the knees slightly bent and with the arms also slightly bent, so that they were on the cross in about the position that I am in at this time. Now, this again is relatively important. It's important because that is the manner in which the executions or crucifixions were normally carried out, and it has a great deal to do with the medical conditions that arise. The usual cause of death on the cross is asphyxiation. The individual is no longer able to breathe. Now, why does that happen? As Christ was suspended on the cross, every time he needed to push himself up, to take the pressure off this very painful area of the wrist, he would have to push up with his feet and legs. When that happened, he would apply a great deal of pressure to the bones and the nerves in the feet. That pain also would be excruciating. So after a while, and tiring, then after pushing himself up or pulling himself up to take the pressure off the feet, then he would drop back down. The pressure again would be on the hands. So any position is an extremely painful condition. Today it would be almost impossible for us to realize the extent of the degree of pain that's involved in such a barbaric sort of an execution. But it was fairly common in those days, so we do have some of the information that I've been giving you. Now, what happens? After a while, in hanging in this position, the pectoral muscles, actually the muscles of the chest, will become paralyzed. Perhaps before that happens, they will begin to, the muscles of the arms and of the legs will begin to go into severe cramps. Those cramps, of course, are something like what we would normally call Charley horses. Now, a Charlie horse is not a very interesting thing to have. If you've ever woken up at night with a Charlie horse, you know that it's extremely painful. You don't know whether to straighten out the leg, to bend it, or what to do. But it's an extremely painful thing. Imagine, if you will, having that kind of pain involving all the muscles of the body. Now, after a while, as I said, these pectoral muscles, or the muscles of the chest, become paralyzed. They no longer are able to function as they should. And the muscles of the chest, or the pectoral muscles, are extremely important for the purpose of respiration. We can breathe in without the use of the pectoral muscles, but it is almost impossible when these muscles become paralyzed and the muscles of the upper abdomen become paralyzed just due to fatigue and accumulation of waste products, which I'll explain later. When those are paralyzed, it's almost impossible to breathe out. So it's easy to breathe in, perhaps, but impossible to breathe out. But it is also impossible to breathe in without having exhaled some of the air within the lungs prior to that time. Now, I think I would like to digress here just a moment to remind you that Christ had 7 different things that was said when he was on the cross. The first 3 of those had to do not with himself, in spite of the pain he was going through, but it had to do with the care of others. The first thing that he said was, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." He was asking forgiveness for the very individuals who were so torturing him. Now, the second thing, he had a statement about taking care of his mother. And then the third thing was to the thief on the cross near him when he said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Understand what a sacrifice this was just to make those 3 statements. Because we do not speak when we breathe in. We have to breathe in and then expel air in order to speak. So every breath of Christ on the cross at that time was so important because every tissue in his body was crying out for oxygen at that time. And yet he used that precious air to speak of others and to help others, not just for himself. Now, what else would happen on the cross? Well, you remember that he's lost a great deal of blood. You remember that he's had nothing to drink whatsoever. There is a process with loss of blood called dehydration, in which there is a decrease in the amount of fluid that is occupying the vascular system. Once that happens, the blood begins to thicken. And as that blood begins to thicken, it is not circulated as well through the body. The body requires that the blood be circulated in order to do 2 things. Number 1, to carry oxygen to the muscles and to the vital parts of the body. But secondly, it is to carry the waste products from those muscles to the lungs and to the kidneys and other organs for excretion of the waste products. When the blood becomes very much thickened, it cannot flow as it should, so it is unable to carry the oxygen it should. Carbon dioxide and waste products begin to accumulate in the muscles, and when that happens, it causes first the cramping that we talked about, and then secondly, almost mercifully, perhaps in this case, it begins to cause a numbing effect over a prolonged period of time, so that the muscles become numb, then paralyzed, as we have suggested. Now, another thing happens under dehydration. We know that when a person has a decreased blood supply, has a buildup of waste products within the body, and when the blood is not circulating as it should, then there's something occurs that we call an electrolyte imbalance. Electrolyte meaning potassium, sodium, magnesium, and carbon dioxide. Actually, when it begins to get upset, that electrolyte balance, then there is a very definite effect upon the body itself, an effect which eventually, without correction, will lead to death. But usually it would not occur as fast as we know that Christ died on the cross. Now, we have discussed the type of cross and why they nailed the feet and why they did nail the hands and why they use this kind of cross without something to stand on, because we've said that that's when they want an individual to die sooner. It is possible for a person on the cross, if they are able to stand upon something to lift themselves, to sometimes live for several days. But in Roman times, if they wanted the person to die as quickly, they used none of these systems. And as I said before, when the muscles become paralyzed, the person dies of asphyxiation, of the inability to get any air within the lungs, or to expel air from the lungs. Now, the only way a person in the position of crucifixion could expel air was to push with those nailed feet and pull with the hands so that the pressure actually down would compress the chest somewhat and cause some air to be exhaled. And when that happened, then they were able to take in some new air. So that is the only way that Christ could possibly have breathed or taken in any oxygen whatsoever in the latter part of the crucifixion, by pushing with those feet and pulling up with those hands. The pain, again, even in a numb state, would be an excruciating type of thing. Now something else begins to happen. Because of the dehydration, because of the electrolyte imbalance, because of the position that the individual's in and the building up of waste products, the heart itself begins to have to function, to pump against tremendous pressure, actually. It's hard to cause that thickened blood to circulate, so the heart will struggle trying to pump it around. The brain is crying for oxygen. The vital organs of the body, including the heart muscle itself, is crying for oxygen, so that the heart is pumping as hard as it can, but that sluggish blood will not flow as it should. Now, after a period of time under those conditions, there is a fluid, a lymph we call it, the liquid part of the blood, which begins to be forced out of the blood vessels into the tissues themselves, around the cells in the body. That causes something we would call in the legs or the abdomen edema, or a collection of fluid within the body. That's a very common thing under this circumstance. But something else more significant happens. Actually, there is a lining or a pericardium around this heart muscle. It's kind of like an envelope or a sac. It dilates to a certain extent with the heart muscle and moves with the heart muscle. But as the heart is struggling to pump the blood, actually after a period of time it begins to force the tissue through the weakened heart muscle into the pericardium or the sac around the heart. That begins to fill with the fluid. And as it fills with the fluid, it becomes dilated. And as it becomes dilated, it causes more pressure on that struggling heart, so that the heart now is trying to pump against the thickened blood, trying to move that much thickened blood, and at the same time it's trying to work against this collection of fluid in the pericardium, or the lining around the heart, which is causing pressure upon it. Now, is that all conjecture? Well, no. Medically, that would be a very normal sequence for what I have described. And then there's another reason that we can feel that this filling of the pericardium was real. You remember that we are told when the soldiers went around to determine whether or not Christ was alive or dead at the end of the crucifixion, we're told that they thrust a spear into his side. Now, pictures all show that that spear went in about in this area, on the right side of the body. That may have been done in the case of Christ, but that was not the usual method of determining or making sure that an individual was dead. The Romans were well aware of the fact that the heart was a very vital organ. So if they wanted to make sure that a person was dead, they usually thrust the spear into the left side between the fourth and fifth rib, because as they thrust it between those ribs, they would reach the heart itself and rupture the heart, and then the person for sure was dead, no question about it. Now, we have said then that, but regardless, so whether it went here or whether it went here, we're told that as they thrust the spear in, that there was, that blood and water came forth. Now, this could very easily mean, and probably could be used as an adequate proof, that they punctured the pericardium, or this sac around the heart, and that the fluid began to drain out. But we're told that it was not only water or fluid, but it was also blood that drained out. Now, this could mean several things. If Christ were not already dead, it of course could mean that it punctured the heart and some of the blood from inside the heart came out. But since he was already dead at the time this occurred, the probability is that the blood was also in the pericardial sac along with the water or fluid. And the only way in which that could have happened would be that there was a rupture actually of the heart. Is that possible medically? Well, yes. Because of the heart muscles' action and working so hard, pushing so hard to try to first force that blood around, and the struggle of pushing and like that with a decreased oxygen supply. By the way, such a decreased oxygen supply to the heart muscle would also produce pain, which we now call the same kind of pain that a person has with heart trouble. And that pain is excruciating. It gives a feeling of crushing of the chest. It goes down the arm. It can be a terrible, terrible pain. And a person who's had this is probably the only one who can describe to you how terrible that pain was. So remember that that heart now is without oxygen, pumping against all the odds, pumping against the pressure. The heart muscle has been weakened by the accumulation of waste products and the lack of oxygen. So it is possible that the heart did actually rupture and some of the blood go into the pericardium, so that when the when the spear was thrust into the side, then that pain, the blood and water that came forth came from the pericardium and would indicate that the heart was ruptured. You will remember that the Old Testament, in its prophecy, said that Christ, that not a bone of his would be broken. Now, the usual way in which the Romans carried out the executions was to go by and break the legs of the individuals on the cross. Now, why that? Because you remember I said the only way an individual could breathe would be to push or get air out of the lungs so that they could bring in good air, would be to push upward on their legs and lift with their arms. Now, if the bones of the leg were broken, it would be impossible for them to push up, so that the paralyzed pericardial muscles, pectoral muscles, would not be functioning, and a person would actually die of asphyxiation, the same way as smothering, if you will. They could not get air in or out any longer, and so they died. And that's the reason for what they call the cruefaction, or the breaking of bones. But when they came to Christ, they found that he was already dead, and as such, it fulfilled the prophecy that not a bone of his body was broken. From a medical standpoint, then Christ died of blood loss, dehydration, leading to a type of shock, leading to a failure completely of the heart to be able to function, and quite probably leading to rupture of the heart. Someone has said that this is equated with a broken heart. And that's perhaps apropos to say. I only know this. I only know that after having studied this, never again will I say that Christ suffered for me or for you without a different feeling than I had before. This cross and the crucifixion was not as personal a thing as it is to me at this time. And so I would say to you that Christ did suffer more than you and I will ever know, that he probably died of a ruptured heart, But even that, a dead Christ on the cross is meaningless. And so we can look forward to Easter because he did not stay on that cross. And so he arose again on the third day. There could be no doubt about his death. There can be no doubt about his resurrection. So Christ did indeed suffer for you and I.
Just to think, friends, of all he hath done for us. Well, we thank you for listening. It is worth noting that there are no copies available of today's presentation, nor are we allowed to make copies due to copyright protection. However, we can direct you to Colossians chapter 3. Yes, here in one of the 4 prison epistles, Paul says this: "If ye then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sitteth on the right hand of God. Set your affection on things above, not on things on the earth. For ye are dead, and your life is hid with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then shall ye also appear with him in glory." While we would surely like to continue, we're out of time. But may we agree, Christ is risen, risen indeed. On behalf of Jim Schneider and all of us at VCY America, I'm Dalton Windsor. We thank you for listening. Have a blessed Resurrection Sunday.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208, or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.
With SRN News, I'm John Scott. A car ramming a barricade outside the U.S. Capitol this afternoon and struck 2 officers. The driver of the car, who was reportedly wielding a knife, was shot and taken to the hospital and has died. Capitol Acting Police Chief Yogananda Pittman, speaking in the last few minutes, had these words.
And it is with a very, very heavy heart that I announce one of our officers has succumbed to his injuries.
The other officer's condition is not known. Authorities say this does not appear to be terrorist-related. President Biden promising to consult with Republicans on his $2.2 trillion infrastructure proposal. White House correspondent Greg Clugston reports.
The president believes infrastructure should be a bipartisan issue, and he says he plans to reach out to GOP lawmakers.
I'm going to bring Republicans into the Oval Office, listen to them, what they have to say, and be open to other ideas.
But Republicans don't like the president's tax increases. Furthermore, Mr.